I'm Patrick Mann. I'm the director of the School for Advanced Studies in the Arts and Humanities. And it's a pleasure to welcome everybody to this, which is our final presentation in our winter 2021 SASAH speaker series. And our theme this year has been creativity, innovation, and justice. And the second term, we've tried to emphasize mentors and storytellers, and we're really thrilled to be able to welcome our guest, Dr. Ebony Elizabeth Thomas, who is a faculty member at Pennsylvania Graduate School of Education, who will definitely help us with storytelling and more. I will shortly ask Dr. Miranda Green-Bartit to formally introduce Ebony. But before we do that, I'm going to turn it over to our Dean, Dr. Michael Milday, to do the land acknowledgement and say a few words.
Thank you, Patrick. And it's a great pleasure to welcome all of you to this important talk. And in this series, it certainly has been a very exciting fall and winter with the pandemic. We've found interesting ways in which to deliver the kind of programming that we need. And this series has been an important part of that, keeping us connected. And I really do want to acknowledge that Western University, where many of us are, and the City of London, Ontario, are situated on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, Lenape, and Arawandran peoples, and also that this land is connected to several treaties that form an integral part of the history of this territory. It is a history that we don't always fully understand, or we only understand it from our limited point of view. And we at the university, and the university is a place of higher learning, we have to acknowledge that we have a special responsibility to confront and address this history and continue the work of reconciliation and anti-racism that is required. And I do see this talk as an important part of that work. So Patrick, back over to you.
Thank you so much, Michael. Before I do turn things over to Miranda, I first of all want to thank her and acknowledge the tremendous work she's doing for the SASAH program, teaching her course entitled Spaces of Their Own, Space, Place, and Power for Children and Young Adults. It's a platform, the one on which Dr. Ebony Elizabeth Thomas has already visited us at Western, and the students had the great opportunity to connect with Ebony in a talk a few weeks ago. In Miranda's course, the SASAH students have been considering how space and place create actual and metaphorical landscapes of power, knowledge, and identity. So through reading, film, and research into sites both local and beyond, the students have considered how children and young adults have largely been left out of critical conversations about space and place, and also the opportunity to query who gets to decide and establish agency in those arenas. So I want to warmly thank Miranda for her work with the students, which, as great education does, is opening up ideas, minds, and worlds. And just one more note before I turn it over. Following Dr. Thomas's talk, Dr. Green-Bartit, Miranda, will be asking the first question, and then one of our SASAH students, Azadeh Odlin, will be asking the second one, and then Dr. Wendy Pearson from Gender Studies and Feminist Research will ask a question, and we're really interested in your questions as well, and you can send them to us through the Q&A function.
Thank you, Patrick, and thank you for those kind words about my course, which has been a lot of fun to teach. So it is my very great pleasure. I'm really excited to be able to introduce my really good friend, Dr. Ebony Elizabeth Thomas, to you today. Born and raised in Detroit, Dr. Thomas has taught in the Detroit Public Schools after she graduated from Florida A&M, a historically Black university. Dr. Thomas is currently an associate professor in the Literary, Culture, and International Education Division at the University of Pennsylvania's Graduate School of Education. Dr. Thomas's research focuses on how people of color are portrayed, or perhaps not portrayed, in children's and young adult literature, and how those portrayals shape our culture. In her award-winning book, The Dark Fantastic: Race in the Imagination from Harry Potter to the Hunger Games, which was published in 2019 by New York University Press, Dr. Thomas argues that there is, quote, an imagination gap in literature and media for young people, end quote. This gap, she contends, is caused in part by the lack of diversity in childhood and teen life depicted in books, television, and film. Dr. Thomas makes clear in her book and in her other published works and in her many talks that she has given that this gap, what she terms a massive failure of the collective imagination, is not due to any failure on the parts of young people. Rather, she refers to the failure, and rightfully so, I think, to the failure of adults. Much of her research, including her many articles, attends to how this failure on the part of adults has affected and continues to affect young adults and children. So please join me today in welcoming Dr. Thomas, who will be presenting a talk entitled "We Have Always Dreamed of Afro Futures, the Brownies Book and the Black Fantastic Storytelling Tradition." Thanks.
Thank you so much for that warm welcome and introduction. I want to sincerely thank my colleague and dear friend, Miranda Green-Bartit, for connecting me to SASAH Director, Professor Patrick Mahan, to Dean Mildy, to my esteemed panelists, to all the faculty, students, staff, and administration of Western University Canada. I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for this invitation to speak today. My talk's title, "We Have Always Dreamed of Afro Futures, Black Fantastic Storytelling Traditions, from the Brownies book to Black Panther," is one that I've given a few times because I'm at the very beginning of thinking about what my next project will be after the current book I'm writing. And so I think I have a few things that might be of interest for you today. So let me share my screen. As I mentioned earlier, "We Have Always Dreamed of Afro Futures" speaks to the central concern of my program of research, the ways that Black American and other African diaspora pasts, presents, and futures are represented to teens and children through the literature, media, and popular culture that they encounter in schooling and society matter for the shaping of the imagination. I look forward to the discussion at the conclusion of this talk. How long till Black Future Month? MacArthur genius and multiple Hugo Award winner Ng K. Jemison's anthology title echoes a centuries-old question in the hearts and minds of many today. Our species and the planet that sustains us are both embroiled in crisis. We are 1 year into a global pandemic that has infected millions and taken many lives. We are facing economic recession all over the world. Millions are out of work, and millions more do not have the sustenance that they need in order to live and thrive. The rise of nationalist authoritarianism threatens to break down the post-Cold War international community. Disinformation has spread unchecked throughout the social web, despite the best efforts of activists over the past few decades. The persistence of anti-Black racism is but one of the many problems that we face in the present moment. The death of George Floyd in Minneapolis this May signaled a summer of protests, counter-protests, cities burning, 1,000 conversations, myriad book lists, without much promise of lasting change here in the States. Although we have entered the third decade of the 21st century, anti-Blackness continues apace, as it has for the long centuries since the inception of the transatlantic slave trade and the imbuing of those with African heritage with permanent underclass status. The United Nations declared 2015 through 2024 as the International Decade for People of African Descent, but slave markets still operate from Mauritania to Libya. The Mediterranean remains both perilous crossing and elusive welcome. The elders of the Windrush generation in the United Kingdom are not yet saved. Broadcasters in China and South Korea have been unapologetic about blackface in programming. And the United States continues its extrajudicial police murders of its own citizenry. At times, such persistent and totalizing oppression seems absolutely inescapable. One might question whether there are any stories that matter right now other than the lamentations for the thwarted potential of lost human life. One might also ask whether inquiries into the whereabouts of Black future months are exercises in futility or frivolity. These are stances that I am confronted with daily as a mentor and advisor to many passionate graduate student activists in Philadelphia. This year, they have been in the streets, while my head has been, as always, in the realm of books and stories of long ago, long from now, and far, far away. How long till Black Future Month, indeed? Most fortunately, the storytelling traditions of Africa and her diaspora have been unbroken by the profound adversity of the past half millennium. In the Gray Album, poet and Schomburg Center director Kevin Young, who's just taken leadership of the National Museum for African American History and Culture in DC, part of the Smithsonian. So that Kevin Young observes that the storytelling tradition of the Black Atlantic world can be characterized as animal tales, the spirituals as codes for runaway slaves themselves, the blues code of life, tragic and comic, laughing to keep from crying, nothing but a good man feeling bad, nothing but a bad woman feeling good. He then observes, the Lost Shadow book is the book that Blackness writes every day, the book that memory, time, accident, and the more active forms of oppression prevent from being read. Yet amid this persistent oppression, there is always ripe potential for new narratives. The spaces between performance and pain, he writes, between Blackness as a problem and a possibility, illuminate our storying tradition. Storying describes the way in which Black writers have forged their own traditions, their own identities, even their own freedom. And so as we exit one pandemic year, we have already exited it, and embark upon the next, there is perhaps no form of Black storying that has more cachet than Afrofuturism. Forget cosmopolitanism. Let's explore the trapped Black mind as cosmos. We are in a cultural moment where speculative storytelling reigns supreme. Afrofuturism is both an aesthetic and an activist movement in the arts. While the term first appeared in Mark Derry's 1993 cyberculture essay, Black to the Future, Alondra Nelson was among those who initiated digital conversations about the intersections among speculative fiction, futurism, and African diaspora cultures. Key critical works on Black American and African diaspora speculative fiction were led by Itasha Womack's Afrofuturism in 2013, pictured here. Other works in this burgeoning field include Sheena Howard and Ronald Jackson's Eisner Award-winning Black comics, Andre Carrington's Speculative Blackness, Michelle Commander's Afro-Atlantic Flight, Sami Schalk's Body Minds Reimagined, and my own book, The Dark Fantastic. Inquire of those of us who study it what we mean whenever we reference Afrofuturism, and you will probably receive very different answers. The Dark Fantastic, while taking heart in the rise of Afrofuturism and the study of Black science fiction, fantasy, and horror, was not about Afrofuturism. That's because the vast majority of stories read and viewed in the West are still written by authors and screenwriters from the majority population and are consumed by mass audiences across demographics. Thus, I considered it vital to focus on young adult literature, media, and cultural production from mainstream authors, television writers, and other storytelling creatives. The networked communities, such as fandoms, where such work is discussed, and the attendant implications for the larger culture. The Dark Fantastic explored the fantastic from the perspectives of 4 stories, 4 fantastic worlds, and 4 Black girl protagonists. Bonnie Bennett from Alloy and the CW's The Vampire Diaries, Rue from Suzanne Collins' The Hunger Games, Gwen from the BBC's Merlin, and Angelina Johnson from J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter series. In my chapter on the Vampire Diaries book series and television show, I examined the way that Bonnie was positioned vis-a-vis beauty and desirability politics, privileging her story over that of white protagonist Elena Gilbert. As I turned to analyzing racial innocence in my chapter on the Hunger Games, it was Katniss' young friend Rue, not Katniss herself, whose positionality I sought to highlight. These dark fictional girls' marginalizations within these media narratives are comparable to the marginalization of peoples of color in schooling and society. A critical race perspective examined how race in the imagination bend such texts at the seams, contorting the reader's sense of space, race, and time. Afrofuturistic dreams can seem elusive because of the persistence of a dark fantastic cycle in the stories that we produce for youth and young adults. Alongside the development of Afrofuturism, I believed that it was vital to explore the way that race operates in the popular fantastic traditions of the West, primarily within mainstream speculative media that is produced in the United States and the United Kingdom and marketed to youth and young adults all over the world. Proposing that Black characters in such stories were trapped in a cycle that I named the Dark Fantastic. My analysis of popular young adult media revealed movement through 4 stages read clockwise: spectacle, hesitation, violence, and haunting. Specifically, I argued that Black characters are interpolated in these imagined story worlds as monstrous, invisible, and or always dying. This mirrors the realities of imperiled Black lives in the world we know. Only through emancipation, either through Black feminist storytelling or agentive youth and young adult restorying, could such characters escape this cycle. All the exceptions are notable. I have heard them all. I've been talking about the book on the road for about the past 5 years, and they prove the rule, or there's something going on with the character. We have the fantastic imagination that we have for a deeply embedded reason. Despite adversity, oppression, and the shadow books lost along the way, Black people in the United States and around the entire diaspora have always dreamed of the Afro future. Traditions of Black storying and storytelling extend deep into our shared past, predating the Middle Passage, yet the door of no return irrevocably transformed the tenor of Black narrative. Eminent Canadian poet and thinker Dion Brand describes the metaphor of the door of no return as that place where our ancestors departed one world for another, the old world for the new, the place where all names were forgotten and all beginnings recast. In some desolate sense, it was the creation place of Blacks in the New World diaspora, at the same time that it signified the end of traceable beginnings. Thus, Black stories beyond the door, a portal, became irrevocably entangled with Black embodiment. We are stories. We are those songs. The Black presence here in the United States came to define the project of the new nation state. As Toni Morrison reminded us over a quarter of a century ago, almost 30 years ago, in her landmark collection of essays, Playing in the Dark. Indeed, what Morrison calls the signing, abiding Africanist presence in U.S. letters is in itself a multitude of stories. Emerging as Black storytellers found new words to share their lived experiences, imbued with their memories and rememories, imagining audaciously future worlds. Although absolutely influential to popular culture in the United States and beyond, and vibrant within our communities here, this Black storying tradition has nonetheless been suppressed over time, from Hollywood to published children's literature. The next 2 graphs will illustrate what I mean about a suppressed Black storytelling tradition. This graph graphic illustrated by David Huck in consultation with Dr. Sarah Park Dolan illustrates statistics from the Cooperative Children's Book Center at the University of Wisconsin-Madison under the direction of K.T. Horning. The CCBC has analyzed trends in children's publishing on an annual basis for more than 2 decades. They found that every year, the vast majority of all children's and young adult books published feature white characters, animals, and machines, a statistic that has not moved much since the 1960s. The work of the CCBC over the past 3 decades has raised public awareness beyond librarianship, education, and children's publishing, and the needle is slowly moving in the right direction. One must give credit where credit is due. As of 2018, 10% of all children's books featured Black child characters. Given the fact that only 15% of children in the United States are of African descent, this seems to be a promising development. However, the situation is much more complicated than that. Radical educator, activist, and artist Maya Gonzalez has pushed those of us working on diversity and inclusion in children's and young adult literature to think beyond the CCBC statistics. Every year, she calculates how many more books would need to be published in order to not only achieve parity with the right side of the previous gap, but also to rectify previous disparities. I invite you to consider the cumulative effect of all the books missing from the shelf year after year, decade after decade, shadow books. I want to go back to Kevin Young. The Lost Shadow Book is the book that Blackness writes every day, the book that memory, time, accident, and the more active forms of oppression prevent from being read. Storying describes the way that Black writers have formed their own traditions, their own identities, even their own freedom, despite this situation. So I want to spend the balance of my talk immersed in this rich Black storytelling tradition, moving through space-time, but asking some critical questions along the way. Early in the pandemic, Arundhati Roy's essay, "The Pandemic is a Portal," went viral on the social web. I quote, "Our minds are still racing back and forth, longing for a return to normality, trying to stitch our future to our past, and refusing to acknowledge the rupture. But the rupture exists. And in the midst of this terrible despair, it offers us a chance to rethink the doomsday machine we have built for ourselves. Nothing could be worse than a return to normality. Historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our data banks and our dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us. Or we can walk through lightly with little luggage, ready to imagine a new world and ready to fight for it." End quote. In the spring, many of us were hopeful about the rupture that the pandemic might represent between past and future worlds. So when we began to see, the possibility of rent moratoria, for distressed individuals or people that lost their jobs. Here in the States, some of us audaciously dreamed that maybe this would be the final hurdle toward universal healthcare or single payer healthcare. A silver lining, if you will, given the role of pandemics through human history. Sometimes societies change for the better, but then George Floyd's life was snuffed out on camera by Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin in Memorial Day, and all such talk here in the States ceased immediately. We realized with horror that the pandemic was not only a portal, it was also an inescapable Taurus. Hartman's "The End of White Supremacy" is a case in point. The persistence of anti-Blackness, even within pandemic time, cannot be overstated. As Claire Colebrook observes, Hartman notes with regard to the 1918 pandemic, for every year between 1906 and 1920, Black folks in cities experienced a rate of death that equaled the white rate of death at the height of the pandemic. Drawing on the work of W.E.B. Du Bois and Walter White's The Work of a Mob, Hartman argues the spectacle of lynching would be enough to generate a form of pessimism in which only the end of the world might generate some slim space for hope. Time is everything, Hartman writes. The rate of Black death had been at peak pandemic levels for years prior to 1918. She's referring to the Great Influenza, our prior global pandemic. Slavery had already been an intersection of slow and fast violence, the slow violence of 400 years of building racial empire, coupled with the sudden spectacle of lynching. By the time of the pandemic, those speeds intersected with uneven healthcare and substandard housing for African Americans, and then the Holocaust of lynchings of 1918. In spring 2020, I asked friends in the humanities as well as historians I knew whether there was any correlation between the Great Influenza of a century ago and the Red Summer of 1919, which brought my maternal grandfather's family to Detroit, Michigan after the violent lynching death of my great-grandfather outside Selma, Alabama. Hartman's essay seems to provide the beginning of an answer to my musings. Oh, the pandemic may indeed be a portal, Roy, but we have found that the afterlife of slavery is a walker between worlds, between universes. Hartman's pandemic meditation harkens back to W.E.B. Du Bois' 1920 short story, The Comet, published as the final chapter of Dark Water, Voices from Within the Veil. The Comet is considered one of the first Black U.S. speculative fiction stories, along with Pauline Hopkins' Of One Blood, which was serialized in the Colored American magazine from 1902 to 1903. Hartman even notes in The End of White Supremacy that the comet appeared at the other end of that previous pandemic portal, 1918 through 1920, 2020 through, we don't know where the end of this dash is, do we? More critical attention is now being paid to the origins of Black speculative narrative in the West. However, it must be observed that in Du Bois' time, as well as in ours, during moments when the present is unbearable, future dreaming provides a way to not only escape, but also to theorize lived experience that at the time feel like an impossibility. The Brownies book. The same year that Dark Water was published, a landmark children's periodical began publication. Edited by W.E.B. Du Bois and Jessie Fawcett and published for 2 years from 1920 to 1921. So the full calendar year of both. The Brownies book was a radical departure from previous children's magazines. Its poems, stories, informative articles, and advice columns were written expressly for Black audiences. The imagery showcased a wide range of Black child life. Readers were apprised of the history and achievements of notable figures, as well as political issues. More importantly, for the purposes of this talk, the fantastic and the speculative was well represented within its pages. As we conclude the multi-year centennial celebration of the Brownies book in my field, one recalls Fern Corey's observation that the fact that the first stories offered to children by the editors of the NAACP's influential magazine, The Crisis, were folk tales and fairy stories, suggests that these genres were central to their conception of an African-American children's literature. While the pages of the Brownies book first issue include the reality of segregation and the necessity of protest, there are many evocative glimpses of whimsy and wonder as well. As Kate Capshaw notes, one distinguishing feature of the Brownies book material is its investment in fantasy. The magazine's larger interest in the fantastic and mystical has been overlooked. As a result, this rich literary history is often obscured from the history of the development of Afrofuturism, the Black fantastic, and other Black speculative creative traditions. The Brownies book is but one example of the shadow book tradition, missing from the mainstream shelf, but ever present in our Black communities. Just as we have always dreamed of Afro futures, we have always engaged in counter storytelling. The process that I have observed young people engaging in online is something that I have called restorying in previous work. Women, people of color, and other marginalized populations have always had to read ourselves into canons that excluded us. One of the first scholars to conceptualize the process of narrating the self into existence was Nolaway Rooks. In her consideration of Black women authors of slave narratives, she writes, Black women writers have begun the task of reshaping and redefining the patriarchy's notions regarding slave women by offering an alternative view of history, a vision which has Black women at its center. While they have not as yet answered all of the stereotypes of Black women that we have come to accept, they have made a definite start. Black women have begun to write themselves into existence. In the world beyond the door of no return, we have had to read and write ourselves into existence. Our children's and grandchildren's generations have restored digital and virtual spaces, setting the social web on fire with everything from hashtag activism to TikTok takedowns, shaping our cultural discourse. Whenever life's portal feels like an inescapable Taurus, restoring is how we survive. And yet there are other ways that we have narrated this self into existence that may have had unintended effects. Before our young people reach their high school and college classrooms, they've already formed ideas about the kind of world this is and the different kinds of people living here. They don't enter their secondary or tertiary education as blank slates. My next book project, which I'm probably going to try to get a head start on before I write We Have Always Dreamed of Afro Futures, the Shadow Book, will chart some of this terrain. The seeds for this were planted right here in this department. So in 2007, at the National Council of Teachers of English annual convention, I picked up Connecticut Poet Laureate Marilyn Nelson's award-winning illustrated chapbook for young readers, Fortune's Bones, The Manumission Requiem. I was fascinated by this story. Fortune's Bones features the haunting true account of an African-American man enslaved by a physician in 18th century Connecticut. When Fortune died in the 1790s, his family was denied all burial rights, and for the next century, his skeleton was used to educate generations of physicians in New England. By the early 20th century, his identity was lost and was only recovered during the Civil Rights Movement. Debates over whether Fortune's skeleton should remain on display at the Mattituck Museum or whether he should be buried raged until September 2013, when his bones were finally laid to rest. Although Fortune's story is starkly typical of what we find in the archives of slavery, I was most intrigued by this children's text as memorial. Nelson, who is a lyrical and evocative poet, uses the trope of the Requiem Mass to remember Fortune. And her verses illuminate the meaning of his life and death to those around him, from his wife and children to his enslaver. She ends the book with the haunting poem, Not My Bones, which places Thich Nhat Hanh in conversation with Black spirituals. It's brilliant. Here's an excerpt. You can own someone's body, but the soul runs free. It roams the night sky's mute geometry. You can murder hope, you can pound faith flat, but like weeds and wildflowers, they grow right back. For you are not your body, you are not your body. These are moving words indeed. However, in the age of Black Lives Matter, travel bans, stop and frisk, zero tolerance policies, schooling during a global pandemic, and what noted legal scholar Michelle Alexander and others have called the new Jim Crow of mass incarceration, a growing number of students of color, poor students, LGBTQ students, disabled students, and other marginalized kids would probably say in our classrooms in response to Nelson's lyrical poem that yes, they are indeed their bodies. And that's just what I mean. When children's and teens' lived experiences contradict those of the people they read about in stories, they probably feel disconnected from characters like Fortune. And yet, this is what they're given as evidence of racial representation in many of our schools. This is where they most often encounter people who are like themselves in books that are meant to teach them something. Beyond studying kids' reader responses, I wanted to take a comprehensive look at all of the books that had come out since the civil rights movement about enslavement, because it really is central to understanding race in children's literature. So, what I did was I wanted to look at the kinds of stories that were being told, who the narrators were in these books, how the history of slavery was being recounted to young people, and how the people themselves were being represented. Among the texts that I reviewed, I found that most featured Black characters who were just triumphing over enslavement. So, slavery is bad, so we get on with it. No matter what hardships they faced, enslaved characters were almost always portrayed as heroic or transcendent, bravely overcoming the structural conditions of their existence, no matter what circumstances they faced. For instance, Love 12 Miles Long is a picture book based on the life of young Frederick Douglass, whose mother was sold to a neighboring plantation and had to walk 12 miles to see him, hence the title. Alongside my graduate students at Penn, I thought quite a bit about how to study image text connections within slavery picture books. Over 7 years and numerous research assistants, we used a combination of close reading and multimodal analysis. We also read literature on enslavement and collective trauma, and we found that enslaved characters' hardships were barely mentioned or described within the text itself. That's a feature of the genre, as Dr. Green Bartik could tell you. In children's picture books, historical context that's difficult is usually left for adult chaperones of the text to recount based on a preface or an afterword that tells you the historical background. While these sections often describe the realities of the peculiar institution, the actual stories that the child reads often lacks the inclusion of those realities. Time does not permit a full examination of this double page spread, but the text reads, in case you're curious, because I know it's too small for you to probably see on your screen. I wish you could live with me, Frederick, Mama said, but you know I can't look after you while I work in the cornfields all day long. Can I come and visit you? Asked Frederick. No, child, it's too far away. How far? 12 miles. But you walk here, Mama. Oh, it's not too far from me, she said. The way I walk makes the journey shorter. Tell me how you walk, Mama. Tell me how you make it shorter. The very real pedagogical challenge that these books present is that the genre of the picture book pulls against authentic representation of slavery. Often, in an artistic effort to portray enslaved Black Americans as fully human, the profound impact of enslavement is diminished on the page for the kids. And subsequently, I would argue from conducting 3 classroom studies in a young person's imagination. Frederick's and his mother's smiles in the face of adversity lend power to this Black author's words. We know from historians of slavery that benign portrayals of enslavement in the 19th century were powerful pro-slavery propaganda. Sadly, the noble goal of humanizing enslaved people through children's books may very well end up sending unintended messages that slavery wasn't all that bad, something that my own 9th grade students assured me almost 15 years ago in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Thus, the noble intent of an author and illustrator to humanize enslaved Black people for contemporary readers might send messages to young people that are unintentionally contradictory. Yes, enslaved people experience the full range of human emotions, but these books tend to provide limited perspectives on complex topics. Those early perceptions don't always get corrected later in a child's education, leading, I suspect, to mass disinformation about our world's past. While we conducted image text analyses on most of the books, wordless picture books with only images tell stories about slavery as well. Unspoken features no discernibly Black characters at all, yet this is a self-described story from the Underground Railroad. Unspoken won a New York Times Best Illustrated Children's Book Award in 2012. Kirkus Reviews positions the young white girl who is the unnamed protagonist as the only focalizing agent in the book, asking in their review, "What would you do if you had the chance to offer a person freedom?" These assumptions about the readership of contemporary children's literature, that the audience is, of course, going to be able to most relate to the white abolitionist position and not to the position of the Black fugitive, are pervasive in our field and in the industry. But Unspoken is not unusual. I don't mean to pick on this author and illustrator. This is the same person that gave us Entangle Makes Three, which was a landmark book for LGBTQ children's texts. So same author. It's in the genre. Children's literature about slavery has generally featured characters who managed to escape enslavement, Black freedmen, and helpful white characters. You see, what I found is that children's books about slavery aren't really about enslaved people themselves. Black characters are usually born free, manumitted, or will be imminently escaping enslavement, because that's what the picture book is all about. It has to have a happy ending, right? I always say on the road when I give a longer talk about just this, that Patsy, that you might remember from 12 Years a Slave, is unrepresentable in children's and young adult literature. She cannot be represented. And yet she is someone whose life was much like the life of millions of enslaved African women during the transatlantic slave trade. Can't represent her. White characters in these texts are almost always depicted as helpful, good, and kind if they're abolitionists, or misguided if they're involved with the slave trade. Characters who are neither Black nor white are rarely depicted at all. This is not uncommon in children's stories, where the implied child reader is most often white, middle class or wealthy, able-bodied, speaks English as their first language, and are both cisgender and heterosexual. Thus, in a book that claims to be about the Underground Railroad, Black characters, and by extension, Black children, are implied to be beside the point. This double-page spread is significant. It's the only place in this wordless picture book where any characters of color are depicted, let alone Black enslaved persons. I regularly teach Unspoken in my popular elective course on visual literacies. I don't dictate what my students should get out of this. I simply present this image and then allow them to draw their own conclusions. They write, they sit in small groups. What do you see here? And we eventually come to the conclusion that if this is a story about the Underground Railroad, where's the cargo? Where's the human cargo on that railroad? Where are the people who are actually enslaved? Award-winning picture book. Not unusual. It seems to be endemic in the genre. One book I do recommend is Dave the Potter. Moving from the curious conundrum presented by Unspoken back to text image analysis, I found that challenges of depiction exist even within award-winning excellent books that I give to my own nieces and nephews. Most of the books I've examined for this project employ external focalization and a third-person perspective. Narration tends to be third-person subjective, sharing the thoughts and feelings of characters, but generally only positive ones. Enslaved people in these stories do not express feelings of extreme pain, anger, or loss, and emotions that we know enslaved people felt. Perhaps authors are attempting to remain neutral or narrate in ways that they consider to be objective. Perhaps they are constrained by the norms of the picture book genre and the young audience. Well, Dave the Potter is a case in point here. In this double-page spread, we see, at the top, let me see if I can, I'm pointing as if you could see it. Oh, Zoom presentations a year in, will we ever get used to these? So in the double page spread at the top, so if you opened up the full picture book, you would see Dave at his workbench. he's at work. We don't see his face. The institution of enslavement itself in these books tends to be discussed in a relatively distant or disconnected way. So even in an excellent book, there's something about the trauma of slavery that you have to cushion the child from. Terms such as master and slave are briefly explained, but for the most part, readers are expected to either have prior knowledge, make their own assumptions, or have an adult chaperone. That means either a parent, caregiver, or teacher or librarian to explain what's going on. The desire for emancipation that David Drake famously inscribed on many of his pots is absent from the book itself, relegated to the afterward. So is the fact that he was literate, which was very unusual and illegal for enslaved people in South Carolina at the time. The fact that in one of his verses he implies that his family was sold away and he did not know their whereabouts is not represented in the text at all. Given the genre and developmental level of young readers, it would be understandable if the authors did not want to give the impression that they're speaking for enslaved folks. However, these narrations through illustrations, poetry, and prose also promote an impersonal sense of distance from the affective experience of people who are enduring some of the most severe racial trauma of modernity. But to what effect? Our fraught racial past evokes many emotions. The story of US slavery, the way that it's been narrated for children and teens, is part of a challenge, a facet of the work that I'm thinking more about, because I'm wondering how we get introduced to how people got where in our very earliest years sticks with us for the rest of our lives. Time doesn't permit for me to go into Slavery with a Smile, which was a controversy in the mid 2010s about two picture books that featured smiling enslaved people. I've written two articles with the first with colleagues about A Fine Dessert, and the second with two of my grad students about the Birthday Cake for George Washington picture book, where which was actually counterfactual. So the picture book was actually not historically correct. They were trying to do a nice President's Day meets Black History Month story and ended up flubbing the history pretty badly. And so we actually did a deep dive into all picture books about George Washington published since 2000, and they all obscure his slaveholding. You know, they blame it on Martha, or they don't mention it at all. And actually, the truth is much more complicated. Toni Morrison really always is who I return to. She truly has, she's the guiding star for so much of my work. I'm deeply reflective as I turn toward a new project. I've been thinking about slavery in children's literature for 10 years, and The Dark Fantastic took me 5 years to write. Although I've worked in other areas across literacy research, I continue to return to the question. I continue to return to questions of textual origins of racism and inequality in society. Children's literature is a site for the origins of ideas about race and racism, not just here in the States, not just there in Canada, but around the world. You know, ever since I was a child myself, I've wondered why Black children show up most often in certain genres of childhood and not in others. I remember growing weary of reading many Black children's books in school. It seemed that if we weren't following the North Star to freedom or marching for civil rights, we were dodging bullets in the ghetto, or we were the Black best friend in the otherwise all white landscapes of childhood and teen life. In recent presentations, my weariness has shown up as a cynical joke about the 5 Black kids you meet in children's stories. It's quite telling indeed that audiences always laugh knowingly. They've met those kids in books too. But as Toni Morrison famously noted in Playing in the Dark, Black slavery enriched the country's creative possibilities, for in that construction of Blackness and enslavement could be found not only the not free, but also, with the dramatic polarity created by skin color, the projection of the not me. The result was a playground for the imagination. What are these playgrounds for the imagination? Who has access? Do we all get to play? And what does it mean for how stories teach us how to imagine the Black presence across space-time, past, present, and future. I want to close with a question that is haunting me right now. Much has been made about our current Afrofuturistic renaissance, perhaps best signaled by the February 2018 release of Black Panther. And youth publishing, 4 major speculative young adult novels were published by young Black women debut authors that year. Perhaps the best known of the 4 was Tomi Adeyemi's Children of Blood and Bone, a Nigerian fantasy adventure, which is going to be a film. But as I've established through this talk, we have always dreamed of Afrofutures. In my first article published after the Dark Fantastic, Notes Toward a Black Fantastic, I applied my Dark Fantastic cycle to 3 young adult novels that preceded the release of Black Panther: Elia Dawn Johnson's Summer Prince, Sherry L. Smith's Orleans, and Zetta Elliott's Mother of the Sea. These 3 stories are critically significant as early harbingers of the current moment in youth storytelling. You see, in the classic children's play, Peter Pan, the imagined white child reader is invited to draw their own fantastic maps. But in Mother of the Sea, The Summer Prince, and New Orleans, those cartographies of imagination work quite differently. The problem of the door of no return looms in all 3 stories. All of these Black fantastic stories are gripping reads told by extraordinarily talented young Black women authors committed to writing for young adults. Yet all 3 fall into the vortices of the Dark Fantastic cycle. Guess why? All 3 protagonists die. Therefore, if even Black authors of youth speculative fiction are haunted by this pernicious afterlife of slavery, this persistence of Black death, which Christina Sharp has talked about in The Wake, what might that mean for our Afrofuturistic dreams? What does this pandemic portal mean for our Afrofuturistic dreams? Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Ebony. That was an amazing talk, and I know that we have some people prepared with questions, and there will be others. So not to rush right into this, but I think I'm going to turn it over to Miranda, who is going to pick up on some thoughts.
Yeah, that was amazing. Thank you so much, Ebony. So I was thinking about a question because I'm, as you know, very familiar with your work. We have talked a lot. And now I'm trying to think about my question in the context of your conclusion. So what I've been thinking about and what I reference in the introduction to my edited collection that comes out next month, not to talk about my own work, but is that
Please talk about your own work. I was hoping to be part of that. And
so as we all know, like, projects take a long time to come to fruition, and that particular project, which examines the absence of Black characters in young adult speculative fiction, it like took 6 years. And so by the time that gets into print, we have this plethora of Black women publishing speculative fiction for young adult authors. And I acknowledge that in the introduction. And so we have texts like the ones that you just referenced, but also Donielle Clayton's The Bells, Justinian Ireland's Dread Nation, Tracy Dion's Legendborn, all texts in which the protagonists don't die as well. And then we have the amazing collection of short stories by Patrice Caldwell, A Phoenix First Must Burn. So as you were talking, and I'm thinking about these texts and Orleans and Zetta Elliott's book and The Summer Prince, like, how do you see these books, almost all of which have been commercially successful? I would say that the 3 that you cited at the end might actually be the least commercially successful.
Well, remember, they preceded Black Panther. Remember,
Absolutely.
Black Panther is the rift there, right? Like,
yeah, and I talk about that with my students all the time, as Azadeh will tell you. So how do you see these books, particularly because they're both critically and commercially successful, changing the publishing industry?
I think that we need to wait a while. And this is why. I am excited about everything that has been published over the past 3.5 years or 3 years and some change. So since Black Panther came out, and there were some in the works. So first, because of all the activism that gained steam in 2014. In 2014, just a number of converging factors happened where it suddenly began to be okay to, well, not okay, to talk about race. In the light of Ferguson, at least in the States. And then, there was the broad Black Lives Matter movement. Earlier that year, Walter D. Myers and his son had written those landmark editorials, where are all the children of color in children's books and the apartheid of children's literature. Really, there something happened in 2014 where a lot of what began coming out in 15, 16, 17, 18, and 19, and then has continued, the industry broke open in a lot of ways. I think that, some of it was time. You started getting a younger generation of folks in publishing willing to take chances on risky stories. Because I had tried to publish a decade earlier. So I'm a contemporary of Zetta Elliott. I'm a Generation X or not a millennial. Not only was I unsuccessful, I was told that my book wasn't marketable. And so you see traces of that in The Dark Fantastic. So I am excited about the current moment, but I have two worries. Number one, my first worry is the authors and creators themselves talking about their experiences and narrating their experiences. They are killing it, as the kids say, but they're also having incredibly, incredibly difficult experiences. So they're getting paid far less money for their book. So yeah, they're hitting the New York Times bestseller list, but they're not being offered six-figure deals. They're being offered, lunch, lunch money, So, I mean, you think $25,000 is a big payday as an advance, or 40,000, but you're selling books and that's parceled out in 4 parts, and then you're a full-time author, so you have to eat. So many of them are having to not only publish multiple things, or they're writing IP. You see them selling short story collections, and they're not happy because they keep talking about it online. So that's number one. Then number two, at least here in the States, I cannot speak about Canada, although I was raised next door to Canada. Your history was neglected in my, so all I know is just from the CBC, which, we watched in the years before cable. But here's the thing about the States. Every so often, every generation, there's like a 5-year period when Black people come in style and we are consumed, and then we're told that the market is saturated, and then there are no more slots because we did that. So Black girl speculative fiction was so 2020. So what happens in 2030? So that's why I like to show that shadow book. I use that shadow book metaphor, which I totally snatched from Kevin Young, and I paired it with the books missing from the shelf, Maya Gonzalez graph. So instead of saying, because I'm already hearing the market is saturated, or I'm already hearing there's too many, and I'm just, what is too many? Just because we're hyper visible doesn't mean there's too many, because meanwhile, if you actually run the numbers, it's not even 5%. It's like, you can literally, you can count every single one that comes out. We all talk about those because those are still the only ones, and then we're making up for many, many, many years of them. So but I am excited about this new moment. Let it continue. Let the authors be able to keep writing. And I'd like to see more adaptations and fandoms that center those authors' works, because we still see, Hollywood fan cultures and merchandising. Those are more mainstream texts or white authored texts. So,
I'm also teaching a creative writing course this semester, a young adult fiction creative writing course. And I tell my students all the time, check out fan fiction, because some of the best work is happening in fan fiction.
And some of those authors you named came out of the fan fiction world.
Absolutely did.
L.L. McKinney, they're so open about having been fangirls in the 2000s.
Yes. Oh, I forgot to mention L.L. McKinney's books. They're so fantastic. Yeah. You and I can just chat forever, as we have said before, but I know that Azaday would like to ask a question.
Yeah. So before I start, I just wanted to thank you on behalf of my class and everybody else in SASAH for your fantastic presentation. It was really informative, and we definitely benefited from your class visit and this presentation on the effect of the 2014 comment. I noticed that we're in a different class. We're talking about Web 2.0 and how Web 2.0 has affected the activists and their activities on the web. Do you think that has also affected the children YA literature move to increasingly have more voices being heard on the social media? What's your opinion?
Oh, absolutely. The world, I mean, I think I am too excited about the web. So my most cited article is with my research partner, Amy Storniaiolo. It's called Restoring the Self Bending Toward Textual Justice. And I end the Dark Fantastic with the same argument, which, radical critics were very upset with me because I said, look at Hamilton. And they said, no, let's not look at Hamilton. If I were writing that today, I would not write that. But but I really do take heart in the ways that young people have made the web their own for, for better and for worse. So not everything that is restored online is good. But I do feel as if the social web has opened up many, many avenues for textual activism or narrative activism. Now, I think in the 2020s, you're going to see more backlash toward that, because what I'm seeing is it's not direct backlash, because I think they've realized they can't bully us offline, because certainly I've received my fair share of trolling. So has everybody from a marginalized identity who has spoken out. But now, I think that the temptation is going to be to start using the web to make money. And so I'm seeing a lot of the people who are young activists in the mid 2010s. This is not the young Black kids. This is some of my queer kids who I've been watching, and they've grown up, and they've built brands, and some are on YouTube now, or some are talking about NFTs, and which is something we don't have time to get into. But I mean, and I get it, because late capitalism is horrible, and my students have student loans, as many of you on this call. Well, I don't know, maybe not as terrible as like a house payment. I would hope not, since there's a better social net. But here in the States, people are like, just they're trying to survive our system that has no good safety net. And so what I'm seeing is some of the young people I was following 5-7 years ago who are really on fire for activism. They want to make some money. And so I'm wondering if some of the activist fervor, because I mean, we just see this throughout recent history, don't we? Like, where these ebbs and flows. So, there was, lots of activism in the 60s and 70s. There was still some in the 80s, but then the 90s came, and then the 2000s, and then last decade, and now, lots of activist fervor. And then, so I just wonder about, Azaday, these ebbs and flows. So I'm enjoying it while it lasts, like sort of activism. We try to make as many social gains we can as humans while we have these moments. And then when, people get tired, I guess we have to, continue. If you keep the fires burning, and, then we have the next cycle of, trying to progress. It'd be nice not to have those times when we regress, wouldn't it, or stop, pushing. But I guess such is history.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Azaday and Ebony. Wendy, do you want to jump in?
Hi, Wendy. I didn't get a chance to talk with you earlier. I was trying to put you.
Sorry, I was running between meetings, so I was a few minutes later than I planned to be. But lovely to meet you, and thank you very much for your talk, which I really enjoyed.
Mhm.
My talk as well. I think I wanted to pick up on kind of the last point you were making when you mentioned your queer students, etc., and just ask you a little bit about, I think in your shadow book world, one of the things that's really missing are books that are really intersectional.
Yes.
So, books that deal with trans kids of color, right?
Yes.
Books that deal with, indigenous lesbians, whatever, right? Any combination and permutation. And I haven't done this in quite some time. I think probably, in fact, about the time the year you wrote your book was the last time I taught our women in popular culture class. But I used to do a thing on YA literature for that course and look up the statistics for the current year in terms of who was getting published. And it was so depressing always, right? Like 2.5% of all YA publishing that year contained LGBT characters. And then when you want to look at LGBT characters written by LGBT authors, the percentage drops. Same for African Americans, same for indigenous peoples, same for everything. And I'm happy that we're seeing a resurgence, or a surgence maybe would be better than resurgence, since Black Panther, basically. I'm just not sure how much that is really putting sort of the intersectional stories on the table.
I would agree.
I wanted to ask you your opinion about that.
First of all, it's just a pleasure to meet you. I agree with you 1,000%. I mean, one of the things that we talk about every year in my children's literature survey class at Penn is that the most challenged books are banned books, another of our myriad problems down here in the States. Almost all of them that are challenged or banned these days are books that we desperately need for our lesbian and gay and trans and gender nonconforming and gender creative babies and kids and teens. And it makes this Auntie Bear really, really furious. It's the thing I always would get in trouble for as a young professor, 10 years ago, because I insisted on teaching. First of all, I have to thank my kids who are, not my kids, my students who are trans and non-binary, who said, Ebony, this is years ago. So like when I was a young new professor, or no, before I was a professor. So when I was a graduate student, I prided myself on teaching David Levithan, and they let me know, girl, that's not it. This is an upper class, like basically, David Levithan books are like, like that's just I don't know. That's like what the Coke, or the new Coke of, I don't know. I don't have a good metaphor, right? Well, but you get it. It's like you're almost not even teaching queer literature when you're teaching like, to upper middle class, cis white boys who are in this perfect world where there's no homophobia. Like, no, you're not being responsible. So unfortunately, they educated, they should not have had to educate me, but they educated me. And ever since then, I've always taught, whenever I could find it, trans, not only YA literature, because they also said, no, you have to teach children's and middle grades, because we need this before we can get to a teen library or we're old enough to get on our own. And it's always been where I've gotten evaluation knocks. Like, and I'm not saying like, oh, I want to be, because now I sound like, like I'm a white person who teaches books about Black people, because that's what you're supposed to do. We're all supposed to be doing that. And unfortunately, they're in our, not just here, I'm sure they're also in Canada, there are those that think that when we teach what we should be teaching, because it's saving kids' lives, that we are pushing some subversive agenda, radical agenda. They question whether or not like our interest in kids, like it's just incredible. But Wendy, here's where I take heart. Fan cultures. I feel that fan culture, the one thing that fandom sometimes gets right, not always, is that once a kid gets to like 13, 14, above Kappa age, they can get into fan cultures where they can meet and, be part of queer storytelling. And it's not enough. We got to do something for kids before, before then. And children's publishing needs to take risks, but so does education and libraries. I mean, I really do feel that so many of our colleagues are abdicating their responsibility to represent all children and all families. And I believe it's an even greater problem than race right now. Not that I'm, throwing that under the bus, but I think we need more LGBTQ books, and we need more books on disability as well. So intersectionality, and publishers, I'm sure they don't want to do it because they'll say, well, they think if you add more facets of diversity, you narrow the audience for the book, instead of thinking all children need all books.
Yeah.
All of it. So
I think you put your finger at the end on a really important point, which is this notion that somehow only Black kids need to see books with Black characters, only LGBT kids need to see books with only Indigenous kids, blah blah. And obviously that's wrong, right? So I mean, one of the questions is, how do we get past that? And I've been actually feeling less optimistic than you. I'm really quite depressed because I've been meditating on the fact that as a high school student in Montreal in 1970, I had the option to, and took advantage of it, take a course in Black literature. Now, that was 51 years ago, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm looking at current high school curricula, and where are the courses in Black literature? Why is the course that I took 50 years ago disappeared?
Yeah.
How is that possible? How did we not make progress with this as educators? Yeah. Right? And I mean, to be fair, my course was a little strange in some respects because there were two sections of it. One was taught by one of the French teachers who was white. Mm-hmm. And I deliberately avoided that because I thought, well, she doesn't have lived experience. So I took the course that was taught by the Black teacher who was actually a maths teacher. But he was actually really good at teaching that stuff, turns out. And, I loved that course, and it taught me so many different perspectives. And, if our students aren't getting that, especially if they aren't getting that earlier, even before we get them into the university, then we're always playing catch up. And, as teachers who regard our pedagogy as a form of activism, I think that gets very frustrating after a while. So I want to be as helpful as you, that we're in this expansive moment, and I would like to see this, but I also want to see, those little percentage figures creeping up, or even not creeping up, actually exploding up would be even better, right? And I want to see more works that are intersectional, and less people trying to, ban books by, there's a trans author whom you may not know called Esper Bergman, and he has a little publishing company called Flamingo Rampant that publishes books for queer and trans little kids, because he has 2 small children. And so he started off making the books for his kids that he wanted them to have access to.
Oh, great.
But he has
online. May I order? Can we order online? Because I'm always developing.
So I'll look the information up and I'll email it to you, Ebony, and I can send it to Patrick if he wants to spread it to the SASAH folks. But what he's often doing is actually fundraising to produce a small batch of books, and then you get them, because he's not really a publisher per se. And, it's always on a shoestring budget, right? And that's another problem for us is, you can do great work on a shoestring budget, but after a while you get really tired of trying to do great work on a shoestring budget, right? Which speaks to other issues that we deal with day to day, right, Patrick?
Absolutely.
I want to jump in here and say, as someone who and there is a question in the chat that I want to get to, but unfortunately, I think, or fortunately, I don't know, it's coming down to individual teachers in high schools in particular, right? I have a 14-year-old who's in grade 9 now. This time last year, last January, thankfully, before the pandemic, we were touring high schools in London to determine which was the best high school for them to go to. And they are not interested in English, much to my chagrin. But we went to all of the English classrooms, and I was like, you're not going to this school. And they said, well, why not? I really liked this program. I'm like, because you don't need to read 5 Shakespeare plays in grade 9 and then another 5 Shakespeare plays in grade 10. We need to you need some diversity. And part of the reason that we selected the school that we did was because the English teacher would have a conversation with us. So I think that comes down to a lot of it. So there is a question in the Q&A, and I'll just, you can see it as well, Ebony, but I will just read it for you. In The Dark Fantastic, you talk about the Harry Potter fandom reimagining Hermione as a Black character and how Rowling's writing left her race ambiguous enough to allow for this. Is intentionally not specifying race a productive strategy for closing the imagination gap? Or is it a form of colorblindness to omit race from the narrative? Does it leave too much room to reinscribe existing racial bias, since in the absence of overt markers of race, white is the default in our society? Avery, that is a fantastic question.
Wonderful question, Avery. Thanks so much for that. Here's the thing. I would have written a different book had it been, different, because I'm just, originally the book was supposed to be titled The Dark Fantastic, Race in the Imagination and Youth Literature, Media, and Culture. And the press director of NYU Press said, maybe we can get attention for it if we say From Harry Potter to the Hunger Games. And so here's the thing. I thoroughly condemn Joanne Rowling's anti-trans stances and I have no clue why a billionaire has a bee on in her bonnet about many of her young readers. And I just have to say that. I know it's not, please, I've said that because I have Harry Potter in the book title. So that's first and foremost. I have to say that anytime Rowling comes up or I'm asked about her in Q&A. So that's number one. Number two, Rowling's writing is sort of like a snapshot. No, it is a snapshot of where children's publishing was 20 years ago. So 20 years ago, the cast of Harry Potter in, its mild nods toward inclusion, racial inclusion, maybe not other kinds, was seen as progressive. So one of the reasons why I got into the fandom and liked it, I thought that it was amazing that there were actually a couple of token characters of color in this rip-roaring fantasy cast, because when I was a kid in the 80s, we were excluded from those books. There was, Phil Nell talks about genre is the new black, and his book was The Cat in the Hat Black. He's at Kansas State University, and Philip Nell writes about the fact that most of the books that he looked at before 2014, so I think he was analyzing before the mid 2010s, most of the books featuring characters of color were designed to teach kids something during a specific designated period of the year. But if it was an adventure story, a mystery story, or a speculative story, it was going to feature a white cast. And then in fantasy and science fiction, usually a white male cast. So even white feminist fiction was something that was exciting to me when I was growing up in the 80s and 90s. I mean, I have Ursula K. Le Guin on a pedestal because she was writing feminist and, so I would look for, feminist and lesbian science fiction and fantasy, even if it was by, white women writers, because that was something different than Asimov and Heinlein and, growing up with Star Trek. So I say all that to say that I think it's really important to realize that she probably was not writing in a time where she had a whole lot of awareness, or where a whole lot of awareness was required about race. So we see Cho Chang, who many young Asian American authors and activists have talked about, that's not even a name, that's two last names. So she doesn't have a first name. She's treated horribly in the text. Actually the Black characters get a better storyline. And so I do think that it's a form of color blindness, but not really. I would name it as whiteness. And I actually got dragged on campus reform for naming whiteness on Twitter. But, and whiteness is not, we hate all white people, but, just like, Blackness is a paradigm, so is whiteness. And whiteness is a system of things, right? And so contemporary whiteness is, yes, we can have the Black friend, the Asian friend, the Latinx friend. We can have the trans friend. They're cool. We can have the gay friend or the gay couple who's part of the ensemble, but we're not going to delve into their lives. They're not going to be at the center of the story. My friend, I'll close with this. My friend Nelson Flores, who does amazing work in bilingual education here in the States, he calls this multicultural, and maybe it's not his term, but he says, that's multicultural neoliberalism. So basically, let's include all these newly middle class people so that we can sell things to them. That's what Rowling and Harry Potter did. I just couldn't see it at the time because I was so excited to get that tall Black girl, who got to go to, the dance with anyone. So I hope that's it's a rambling answer, but that's sort of where I am with Potter right now.
Amazing. I'm going to jump in. We're getting close to the time to wrap up, I suppose, but I can't wrap up until I want to ask you a little bit more about the challenges of depiction, as you put it so wonderfully. I loved your analysis and your talk about some of the children's literature and the sort of image-text relationship. My area is visual arts, so I think about these things. And it's not as if I'm going to ask you for a recipe, but I wonder if there are ways in which you see that working better critically. And then I was thinking about some of our students who are really interested in graphic novels, and we have a few who are doing graphic novels as part of their independent research project. And so I was wondering, are there Black authors or authors who are getting it right in terms of Blackness and Black representation? And I know that's not what your talk was about, but it seems to me to really be an interesting extension from some of the challenges you were raising.
There are so many. Thanks so much for the question, Patrick. There are so many authors who are getting it right and getting it intersectionally right. One filmmaker, actually, who I think I wish would write children's books, who is just so intersectionally amazing, is Barry Jenkins. Like, I almost want Barry Jenkins to have his own, like, we don't have a Moonlight in a picture book that I can give to, my little nephew who is questioning. Like, so turning and trying to find books for babies is just so hard. Like, where do they go? Who can they find? So I think that if we could get maybe some of those creatives to do that. But, I also really welcome what's happening in Black horror. I think that if you look at the various speculative genres, the people who are actually doing it right, although there's lots of conversation about this, are the Black horror authors, filmmakers, etc., where they're basically positioning, some people are calling it Peelian horror, after Jordan Peele, and then others are angry because, Jordan did not invent that kind of horror, like presenting racial terror as horror, or rich white people as the monsters. I mean, that actually is like it's not just limited to Black creatives, like, thinking about the wealthy or like, actual monsters. That goes back to vampire, okay, let me stop. You didn't, we have 2 minutes left, but people with privilege who are, monstrously preying on others. But I do wish that we could get Barry Jenkins like folks from all backgrounds creating books for children, and then Black horror, basically using stories like Lovecraft Country, Watchmen, while consulting with Asian creatives, because they got a lot right with Black history, but they didn't do a good job, with the Asian storytelling. If we could get more of those people, then you can make history fun. You could to mix in like this, sort of, I don't know, it's like the Abraham Lincoln and zombies thing. So it's like you get the history, then get something cool. But, I know some of my activist friends who do children's literature, I'll close with this, they disagree with that. They think that when you mix the hard history with the speculative, that you, if it's not done carefully, and they said, Ebony, it will not be done carefully, you run the risk of it being trivialized.
Yeah.
So
Well, I mean, I would certainly say, and this my exposure is more in the visual art world and in video art and that kind of thing. I think we see some amazing Afro future related work that is not trivializing and is really complicated. Now, again, that's for adult audiences more than children, but it's an interesting.
Children can deal with here comes Miranda into, we believe children are ready. I'm not disagreeing. I'm agreeing with you, and we need to see that in work for children and teens, because our kids can deal with the complexity because they're living complex lives in a complex society. So.
Well, this was amazing. I get the privilege of thanking you. And I want to thank you for an amazing talk. And the discussion period was fantastic. But also, I just think you're so vibrant and such a great teacher that, you have done so much for us today, Ebony. So thank you so much. And let's just bring Ebony back every year.